Hi everyone, I'm going to do my presentation over Apu Olante and how Inca theater can be used to understand how the Incas interacted with Western Amazonian societies. The official title of the article I used is Apu Olante, Inca Theater as an Example of the Modes of Interaction Between the Incas and Western Amazonian Societies by Cristiana Bertazzoni. You can see it right there on the screen. But before I start, I'd like to apologize in advance in case I mispronounce anything. And without further ado, let's start. The article I chose explains how Apu Olante can be used to give us a better understanding of the relationship established between the Incas and the Amazonian corner of their empire. Historians aren't very sure what kind of interactions happened between the Incas and the Western Amazonians. They've tried to solve this problem by looking at different pieces of literature, such as Apu Olante. What we have figured out is that the Incas used their ideologies to hold on to the power they had over the Amazonian corner of their empire. But before I can talk about that, we first have to understand a little bit about the history of the Incan theater. The Incas created both tragic and comedic plays that were made to celebrate their victories and territorial conquests. Although the main purpose of these plays was mostly so that they could spread Inca values and ideology. We can see some of these Incan ideologies very clearly in Apu Olante, which I will be talking about in just a moment. The article goes on to talk about how important of a tradition theater was for the Incan culture and how there are two different kinds of genres of plays that they made. But in the name of not going over the time limit, I'm going to have to skip that information as it also doesn't really pertain to what I'm talking about. Apu Olante is very obviously written from an Incan perspective as it gives a clear representation of Incan ideology. This representation commemorates and magnifies the victories that Incas had over the rebels of their empire. The play paints Olante as a rebel since he wants to marry Cusi even though he's not of royal blood. In the very first scene, he was warned that if he were to disobey the law and pursue his love for Cusi, then he would suffer a tragic death. This is where we see the first Inca ideological display. You are either a good citizen and obey the laws of the Inca, or you die. The second display of Inca ideology was when we find out that someone of royalty can only marry another person of royal blood. This rule was not always set in place, which is why when it became law, this play helped to reinforce the law. Marriage was one of the Inca strategies for interacting with the Western Amazonian societies that would eventually help them acquire new lands to expand their empire. This strategy meant that they would take elite women from these societies and give them as secondary wives in the Inca capital of Cusco. There would pretty much never be a time that royal Inca women were chosen to be wives to the elite in a Western Amazonian society. This is why it's such a big deal that Olante and Cusi wanted to get married. In order for an alliance between the Inca and the Western Amazonian societies, Olante would have to give up pursuing Cusi. Reading the article helped me to comprehend what exactly was going on in the play, and I think that when Cusi's brother forgives Olante and says he can marry her, he was actually just using it as a political device to keep the Western Amazonian corner of their empire subdued. I think this because the article explains that Olante was actually a very powerful chief among the Western Amazonians. So, under the guise of being an amicable ruler, Inca Tupac Yupanqui allows Olante to marry his sister because it's just easier than going to war. This situation kind of reminds me of the saying, keep your friends close and your enemies closer, because by letting Olante marry his sister, he not only avoids war, but he is also guaranteed a way for the Incas to continue ruling over the Western Amazonian society.